Hello. In recent weeks, we've been looking at the people in the Old Testament and how their faith can encourage us, inspire us, and teach us. These people come in different shapes and sizes, as does their faith. They face different challenges, and they all respond differently. Today, we're meeting Ruth, an unusual candidate for an example of faith. First of all, she's a woman, and most examples in the Bible are men. Secondly, she's young, with no standing or status in the community. She has no upbringing or teaching on Yahweh, the God of the Bible. And most of all, she's a foreigner, a Moabite hated by the Jews as an idolatrous people. She's also the wife of a refugee. And yet, she has a book in the Bible named after her. And the book of Ruth addresses some pretty big themes relevant to many of us today. Themes like marriage and widowhood, the prospect of childlessness, single parenting, the loss of a child, family and belonging, male and female relationships. The challenge at the start of the book of Ruth is loss. Naomi has lost her husband and both her sons. They've all died very quickly after each other. She's now extremely vulnerable in a male-dominated world. Life is very dark for her. They say suffering is wanting what you don't have and having what you don't want. This is true for Naomi. Her daughter-in-law Ruth has also lost her husband and her chance to be a mother. And she's now about to lose her identity, her family, her home, her traditions, her culture, and her country. So how is this relevant to us today? Well, we have lost our freedom, our routine. Some of us have lost our income or our jobs. We've lost physical contact with family and friends. And please don't underestimate how big this is, particularly for people who live alone. And some of us have even lost family and friends to COVID-19. Where there is loss, there is grief. Someone described grief as tearing a hole in the fabric of life, and we then spend the rest of our lives trying to mend those holes. Do look at the whole of the book of Ruth. These 4 short chapters in just 20 minutes will give you her story as we have it. It touches on vulnerability and the fragility of life, poverty and famine due to climate extremes, exploitation, migration, and survival. It could have been written in the 21st century. If we were to summarize, we could say that chapter 1 is all about weeping, chapter 2 working, chapter 3 waiting, and chapter 4 a wedding. But this morning we will concentrate on chapter 1, weeping and loss. What can Ruth teach us? How can she help us? Well, Ruth and her sister-in-law Orpah have already been through a lot. Did you assume that they fell in love with their husbands and were enjoying a longed-for life together? May not be so. The end of the book of Judges suggests that they may have been seized, claimed, raped, and then married. So now this young woman, Ruth, is free of her 10-year forced marriage and those Israelites who invaded them. And yet, in her loss, Ruth chooses to stay with her Israelite mother-in-law. In her grief and her loss, her focus is the opposite of what you would expect. Ruth shows loyalty, kindness, compassion for Naomi, and respect for her mother-in-law's needs and wishes. So, what is our focus when we experience loss? Is it our needs, our feelings, our wishes? These are not wrong or unimportant. We all need to focus in different ways so that we can move on from the past and the present to the future. There is no one size fits all. But remember, we do need to mend the holes that grief has torn in the fabric of our life. Spend a moment thinking how you, with God's help, are mending your holes so that your life can be repaired. Secondly, Ruth also shows incredible faith for a foreigner from an idolatrous nation. You see, the Moabites were descended from Lot, Abraham's nephew, who was very much influenced by his environment and made some very bad choices. And so the Moabites are called, in inverted commas, an unclean people. They worship Chemosh, whose name most likely meant destroyer, subduer, or fish god, and they induced the Israelites to join in their sacrifices. It was a bit of a love-hate relationship. And there's no chance of Ruth or Orpah getting a husband if they go back to Israel with Naomi, because their ethnicity makes them unsuitable. Yet Ruth, a Moabitess who has been captured and violated by Israelite men, says to Naomi, her Israelite mother-in-law, "Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." This is even more amazing when we see the bitterness that Naomi had in her heart towards God as a result of what had happened to her. So in a time of loss, where is your faith? It is so tempting to ask, why did this happen to me? Maybe a better question is, why did this happen for me? What good can God bring out of this situation for you and those around you? You can become bitter, like Naomi, or better, like Ruth. Grieving is part of being human. To deny or suppress it as being unspiritual is as daft as it is dangerous. Personal faith can bring comfort and strength. But it is said that there are two types of grieving, one with hope and one without. A young woman just before her husband's funeral was asked how she was feeling, and she replied, "My life ends today." The hope that sustains us is that Jesus has beaten death, and that it is not the end, but the beginning of new life. Ruth reminds us that grief can sometimes be part of a process that leads us to a greater faith. And thirdly, Ruth shows us that although we have no idea what the future holds, God does, and we can trust him. The late Queen Mother lived as a widow for many years, and another young widow once asked her, "Does it get any better?" The Queen Mother gave an honest answer which comes out of experience. "No, but you get better at dealing with it." Ruth embraced her future, probably thinking she would be gleaning fields with the other poor people for the rest of her life. She knew Naomi would die one day, and then she would be left alone. There was no pension waiting, but she trusted her future to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and then watch that future unfold in ways that she could never have imagined. Ruth leaves a legacy for anyone living with loss by showing us what to focus on, how to lean on your faith, and who to trust for your future. We will now have 2 songs. Faithful One. Maybe like Ruth, we can discover how faithful God is, and when we do that, we can learn to trust him. So then we'll sing "The Lord's My Shepherd" with the refrain, "I will trust in him alone."